Hello and welcome to Time Jumpers Incorporated. You have selected a one-way journey from 1988 to 2023.
Connection established.
To begin, please upload yourself into Temporal Relay Unit 178B and leave your body by the door marked Incinerator. Thank you, and we wish you luck in all your future endeavors.
Technicians of Spaceship Earth, welcome to Hawkbinge. We are following the footprints in the sands of time to the brand new Hawkwind album, The Future Never Waits, a trip of about 35 years from where we last left the band at the end of Xenon Codex in 1988 to 2023. And your guides on this trip to the future, which is not waiting, includes not one, not two, but three new listeners. Of course, we have Matt in Berlin. Hello, Matt.
Hello, Andy.
And we have me in Brighton. Hello, me. We also have friend of the pod, Joe Banks. How you doing, Joe?
Hi, I'm good. Back again. Thanks for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. Of course, you're now working on things other than Hawkwind, so this must be like Scarface for you. Soon as I think I got out, they pull me back in.
Yeah, it's funny you should say that. Yeah, I actually am working on something else at the moment, but actually am also working on a Hawkwind-related project as well, which I may talk a bit more about if you give me the chance.
Outstanding. And you have been back in the world of Moorcock recently, haven't you? Because you made a fantastic appearance on Breakfast in the Ruins.
Yeah, with Andy talking about the final programme, the film version of that, which still to this day is the only Moorcock novel which has been filmed, and of course features a 2-second blink and you'll miss it appearance in the background by Hawkwind themselves.
Outstanding. So we'll overlook the fact that you've been seeing other pods behind our back. You're still friend of the pod for us.
Thank you.
And Matt, how is life in Berlin?
Life in Berlin is good. Today, in fact, has been a fantastic day. I've had a whole bunch of deck furniture, which has just been remaining in its cardboard boxes because it's done nothing but rain. But today was a rainless day, and we've had the whole day to just plow through as much as possible this album. So it's getting a bit late in the evening now, but it's almost 9 o'clock with me, and it's still a bit of light outside. So it's actually really feeling like spring, which is fantastic. So it's been a nice day to enjoy an album such as this.
Excellent. Of course, last time we did this, we did Somnia when that came out, which was in September 21. So it's about 18 months ago.
Yeah, I was going to say, and what progress we have made between them making albums.
Exactly. We've, in a true Hawkbinge fashion, have skated through the 1980s. So you've got a little bit more context this time around, a bit more Hawkwind under your belt. Last time, I remember in the wrap-up, we were all fairly positive about Somnia. It was kind of an interesting one. But I also remember that you were in New York, so you'd literally only had it for a couple of hours because it was obviously evening hour time on the release day. I actually have gone back and played it a few times, which has been interesting. And I remember that there were things on there that we all liked. So it'll be interesting to see this time round. Different lineup, of course, now. We have an actual bass player in Doug McKinnon and Tim Lewis, a.k.a. Thigh Paul Sandra. But I suspect I might be calling him Tim for the rest of this podcast.
Me too.
I saw them live at Hawkfest, and after that I tweeted that I thought that this was a really powerful lineup and had some expectations. And as usual, expectations are very dangerous things to have for Hawkwind albums because as Matt knows, given that he's a first-time listener on every album we come across, your first reaction to any Hawkwind album is the WTF, and then you kind of grow into it from there. So I've actually had a fairly meeting-free day. I remember with Somnia, it was quite patchy and I was having to play the album for a bit and then not for a bit and then play a bit more and then go back to it. Today, I've actually been able to give it a pretty good run. And funny enough, my thoughts have evolved over the course of just a few hours. Matt's obviously had a decent day of it. Joe, have you managed to cram in a few listens?
Yeah, I actually have listened to it a couple of times, which again is great because I think with Somnia, I think I only did do one listen. So it's great because, as you say, your view on something changes even over, just a couple of listens. So yeah, it's great to have actually had that chance.
100%. Well, let's dive in then and go through this album and see how we all get on with this. I've actually taken some notes for the first time, which is a lesson I learned from Somnia, where I didn't take notes and was constantly having to remember what we were talking about. This time I have notes. And of course, the album opens up with a 10-minute instrumental, which is a pretty bold thing to do. Of course, they open Somnia with a 10-minute track. As friend of the pod and guest star of the show, Joe, your response to The Future Never Waits?
As you say, it's quite bold, starting with a 10-minute instrumental. And it starts off in almost kind of classic space rock fashion. It has these industrial robot type noises. But then it goes into this kind of rather lovely mellotron part. I suspect, obviously, it's not a real mellotron, but it's a mellotron patch. But it sounds great. There's lots of nice, what I would call utopian keys kind of floating around it. A bit of vaguely ethnic sounding percussion. And yeah, what you then kind of head off into is Hawkwind's version of a come down track, really. And it does have that kind of late 90s vibe to it to a certain extent, but it's definitely not just a throwback. It definitely sounds like a track made in 2023 as well. I think one of the first things also that I noticed is that the production on this is significantly better than we've had for a while.
Isn't it just?
This sounds really good. And I think the addition of Doug and Tim, from a practical point of view, as much as anything else, has made a huge difference because Tim has obviously brought in a load of keyboards. There's a load of very, very nice keyboard sounds on this and really lush synth sounds. And I suspect that kind of some of the keys that Hawkwind have been using over the last few albums haven't been, kind of the same quality. And it obviously shows. Whereas this, and this is reflected really throughout the whole album, sounds, it's a horrible word, but it sounds a lot more professional just because of the quality of the instruments that they're using. And obviously because Tim, by trade, is a proper keyboard player and Doug is a proper bass player. And that also makes a huge difference to the sound. Often you have Hawkwind instrumental ambient type tracks and they're pretty good for a few minutes. And then it's like, okay, they've drifted off, but they've decided to keep another 8 minutes going anyway. Whereas this actually feels like it's progressing as it goes through. There's lots of little whirls and eddies in it, lots of little nice pieces of arrangement. It actually feels like an arranged track. I was very, very impressed with this track.
Yeah, Matt, Tim is all over this and it is well constructed.
Very well constructed. I think comparing this to what they did last time when we did our Nexus event, Somnia, Somnia was a dark, brooding, paranoid, quite story-rich piece, which was kind of like a three-piece that were all in different rooms, cobbled together slightly, but, a bit more rocky and maybe like quote-unquote traditional in its construction. This is much more like a big, gloopy lava lamp of a track and actually largely sets out the tone for the record in general. I think it's a real vibe, personally. Just like Joe said, I think the whole thing is interesting. It kind of wallows in its own directionlessness as a track. It's not atonal, but it's also not super melodic, and it actually relies on layers of different minimal amounts of synth to create the complexity rather than one setting a melodic tone. It's almost like Joe said, they brought in every keyboard they could find and they're just playing a few notes on all of them. So the richness is actually through the sound design and through the different timbres that you get from synthesizers rather than one doing all the work with then maybe a bed or a lead or something. And it's kind of nice because it's just like, oh, different tone, different tone, different tone. So it kind of washes around and undulates and has this nice tapestry feeling to it, which I really like. It's interesting that the start of Xenon Codex starts with a kind of tick, 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 like a clock, because we're talking about The War I Survived. This starts with a kind of tick, tick, tick. It's a bit different, but I think it still sounds like clock-ish. So it's funny that we've just finished an album where that happens and we're in another album. I know they're talking about the future. Makes sense. Use a clock. Why not? But it's integrated into just general strange noises, which makes you feel like they're still experimenting with sounds and tone beyond just the predictable. I think there's a really good interplay between all of the beds of synths and this slightly overdriven bass line. It feels like it's just clipping or something, just it's got a little bit of fuzz, a little bit of grit at the top. And I think that just adds to the grit of the piece somehow. And it kind of like drags it down when the track's trying to float up with all the synths. It's being pulled down again with the bass. Because of that, I find it's very hard to categorize this track. I was writing like space lounge, hard ambient, double post synthwave. I have no idea, but the idea of a bass that hard is not normally found with tracks this floaty. So I think they found a really interesting way to experiment. Same with the drums. They're nice. They're not too thumpy. Lots of incidental percussion that just tie the piece together and gives you some way to nod your head without it being too floaty. But again, nothing too crashy. So the whole thing still remains quite buoyant, but it's just the bass is just adding that extra little bit of low feel in the sub in the bass, which I don't think we ever really got in Somnia. It never sounded like it really came together, but this one does sound like it was studio produced or something, and there's a beautiful separation in everything. So yeah, to have 10 minutes of this, very, very happy.
It's interesting, isn't it? But the opening, the first few seconds are quite ominous. It's foreboding. But then it instantly changes into something which is not foreboding and ominous at all. And I realized throughout the album, that happens 3 or 4 times, that you get this ominous first couple of seconds, but then suddenly it does something completely different. And that caught me out definitely on first listening, because my expectation coming in was going to be something quite heavy, quite powerful, because of having seen the lineup and that tweet that I put out after that first lineup. That's been in my head since then. And obviously we've seen them since then, but it starts and it goes somewhere completely that I didn't expect. And so the first time I heard it, I probably took about 5 minutes to accept what was happening. And it was the second time round when I knew what it was going to do that I was actually able to really get into it. And then after that, I was really just happy to properly zone out to it, particularly if I was working while it was on. It was a really pleasant space to be in. But it's a track that's got better for me each time I've heard it. And you're right, Joe, in pointing out the difference in quality, both of the production and the kind of the number of sounds. And I can imagine, A, that's Tim Lewis coming on board, and B, the difference between the 5-piece band recording together in the studio, which is what I imagine has happened here, and the 3 of them recording remotely and sending patches to each other, which is what they did to get Somnia out. And Somnia is a bit triumphant given that as a process. But this is entirely different. And yeah, really, really interesting. I like the transition when the drums kick in. I found that very satisfying as well. So yes, it's a, as always, unexpected opener, but really takes you somewhere nice. I'm a fan of this track now for sure. And it leads us to the end, which is interesting sequencing. I like it. I'm going to come to you first with this, Matt, because this starts off with a riff. And on Xenon Codex that we've just done, obviously we got to Neon Skyline, and your WTF moment with Neon Skyline was, it's a really basic 4-chord riff, and I'm surprised it's on the album. And because that's still fresh in my mind, even though we actually recorded the Xenon Codex episode a lifetime ago at this point, given the pace we record at, when I heard the riff, I just thought, oh, that's one of Matt's 4-chord riffs.
Yeah, this track unfortunately kind of harshes my mellow after the first track has been so nice in so many ways. For me, the recording quality drops. It not just drops, it plummets, it tanks. It sounds like this is recorded in a garage or something. It doesn't sound like it belongs on this album at all in terms of quality. So I feel like that's an immediate strange difference to have to deal with going from the first track. It just feels like a bad cover of Buddy Holly by Weezer or something, or like an early Green Day track, but with this bit of Coldplay thrown on top of it with the little like synthy bit going on. I know there was that thing where Hawkwind were accused of being dad rock Insomnia, and I refused to accept that. I thought actually there was still some experimentation and some quality in there, but this for me feels dad rocky. The quality doesn't help it. I feel like the riff is uninspired. the vocals sound drudgy and muddy and get sucked into the guitar riff to the point where I find it very difficult to hear what's going on. And again, for me, it has that kind of 90s punky indie vibe to it, which I've heard so many times before. This sounds kind of slow and labored, and it doesn't sound fun. I know they're trying to be. I can kind of feel the effort, but the effort is not getting me anywhere. So I feel like it's a bit of a disappointment. The instrumental breakdown's more engaging, but I still feel like it's a little bit muddy and lacking detail. And, you know, after such a nicely produced first track, it's not enough really to dig it out of the pit that it's left itself in. Everything feels very close together. Everything feels like it's bumping elbows, which then adds to this kind of like mudball feel that I've got listening to it. It's funny that they called it the end, because at the end they say there is no end. And right now, listening to this track, I really wish there was no end. That vocal at the end is uttered in what I would describe as Saturday morning cartoon villain voice, which doesn't help me take this track any more seriously than I already am. The only good thing about it is that there's quite a nice smooth transition from one track to the other. And I was thinking, where was that in the 80s? Not dealing with any of these fades anymore. But no, I think all the things I like about the first track means that I really find this track a complete nothing burger, unfortunately.
At least the end is only 4 minutes. Joe, can you save the end for us? Can you rescue the end?
Yeah, it's quite a contrast to the first track. Without wanting to jump forward too much, given the general vibe on a lot of the tracks on this album, it feels as though this is one of those tracks where they thought, you know what, at some point we've got to do a couple of rockers. Let's do a couple of rockers. And that's what this kind of sounds like. It's the kind of thing which I'm sure Dave Brock could knock out in his sleep. And he does sound a little asleep in the vocal department on this. He's quite far back in the mix, kind of struggling to be heard a little bit. I didn't dislike it as much as Matt, but it's a bit of a kind of Hawkwind Me Too track. It's got that kind of chanted vocal that Dave is renowned for. Reminded me a little bit of the vocals in Arrival in Utopia. But yeah, I mean, it's okay, but there's not really that much to say about it. I didn't feel that the quality of the sound dropped as much as Matt did, but then my ears are quite a bit older than his, so that might have something to do with it. But yeah, it's fine, but it's nothing to write home about.
The one thing that I was listening for is that the drummer is really trying to do something. There's lots of fills, there's lots of animation, and I feel that even that is not bringing it up. And I think it's because, for me, it's muddy. You know, there's not any clear thwacks, and just all the going around the kit just starts to add to the mud. And that's what I feel like, you know, everything feels like it's touching each other. So that's what I feel, I guess, by the quality. I know that there's some fuzz in the guitar for sure, but it just doesn't feel like there's a separation that was in there previously.
That's interesting, because I actually like the drums on this. Weirdly, I probably like the drums for the reason that you don't like the drums. I don't think we're hearing something different. I think we're just connecting with it completely differently, because I like what Richard Chadwick is doing on this. It comes across to me as almost a sense of chaos at play, which I actually quite enjoyed. It's more than filler, but it doesn't stand out for me on the album. And it's one of, 4 kind of rock tracks, and it's not the best of those. I did enjoy the middle section and the very Tim Blake-esque solo on the synth. Probably because it has the, there's a word for it that I can't remember, but the pitch bending.
The legato.
Yeah, and I love that. And that kind of took me back. There was something interesting about that. And I didn't mind the ending with what sounded like machine guns going on in the background. I don't know if they actually were, but that's kind of what it came across to me. I didn't mind it. So I'm kind of in Joe's camp, really. I'm certainly not offended by it. And I'm quite happy with it coming on and doing its thing. It does its job at 4 minutes. It doesn't need to be 5, 6, 7 minutes. I think at that point, I probably would have lost interest. So the fact that it's quite punchy is okay for me. And I think in terms of the album sequencing, given what comes next, they probably did need something upbeat and punchy, basically. I don't think you would have wanted to go necessarily through a set of tracks without something with that kind of energy in it. And that's partly because we go next to Aldous Huxley, which is a really interesting little thing that sounds very 90s Hawkwind to me. And obviously we're just about to start 90s Hawkwind. So I've either scared you horribly now, Matt, or intrigued you, one of the two. And the story of Aldous Huxley, which I didn't know, that he was injected by his wife with LSD at the point where he was near death. But as a description of an acid trip, it's kind of trippy. And the piano, it's all very dreamy again. It reminded me a little bit of some things in Somnia. going in, that spoken word thing with dreamy stuff going on within it. And I think Tim and Doug go very well together as far as this goes. I'm assuming that a lot of this is Tim. We know that Magnus plays both guitar and keyboards and sings and does a lot of things within Hawkwind and writes quite a lot of music as well. But it sounds a bit Tim. Did you have more fun with this one, Matt, than you did with the end?
Yeah, absolutely. I was intrigued when I saw the track listing that they had a track called Aldous Huxley, because we've heard Hawkwind make odes about people before, but they've always been fictional, at least up to my current knowledge of the band. So for them to make a track which isn't actually about Aldous Huxley eventually when you listen to it, it's more, like you said, it's more taking a sliver of his experience and using his words, which I actually quite like. So yeah, I thought it was going to be interesting, and it was, but not for the reason why I thought it would be. So I was happy to be surprised. I'm a big fan of Brave New World, so to hear Aldous Huxley's voice and his experiences was very cool. I didn't know that story. I don't know much about him as an author. I only really know his work. But the vocals meeting this lush ambience that they create, I really like. The one thing that's strange about this track for me is it feels like two tracks in one, because just after about 2 minutes, there's quite an abrupt cut, and we switch from ambient pads to a piano, which comes in. And I don't really know why they decided to not make that more of a blend. The fact it kind of stops and then the piano starts, I can't really explain. I don't think it's doing much for the track. I don't hate it. I'm just surprised. But when the piano comes in, it's really nice. It picks itself out. Again, the detail is back. The production from track one is back. So the separation is really nice. A piano is very evocative when it's recorded nicely. And this one really is. It sings through the whole piece. When you have a piano with a bit of a bed with some slightly abstract voices, reminds me of the now dearly departed Ryuichi Sakamoto. You know, it feels like some of his early work, or maybe even early Brian Eno or something. You know, it sounds semi-improvisational, like the piano's kind of picking itself out through the bed. The vocal samples are just doing their thing. They're helping paint this strange world around you. It feels very modern classical, which is something I never thought Hawkwind would have a go at, but also why not? They take a swing at everything. So yeah, weird abrupt switch halfway through. I really like this track. I think it's very nice. Again, it feels like it's kind of working with some dated constructs. You know, I'm pretty sure Ministry of Sound chill out albums had things a little bit like this in the late 90s, early 2000s, but I feel like this is kind of brought up to date with some of the synth voices and the way that it's been produced. So it feels old and new at the same time, which has this modern vibe to it. I think it's really nicely constructed. Very happy to wallow in this a little bit in a different way to the first track, because the first track doesn't have those vocals, you know, so I think this is a nice addition and expansion on this kind of vibe that they're blending into this whole album.
Joe, we're back in the good books again. A song about a writer, which obviously must put it in your good books too.
Yeah, I don't have much more to say other than what Matt's already said. I mean, it is interesting. Aldous Huxley, I was thinking actually, it just occurred to me that he's referenced in one of the songs on the very first Hawkwind album, on Mirror of Illusion, where Dave is talking about the perception doors, which is The Doors of Perception, obviously being the novel that Huxley wrote after he had experimented, I think it was with mescaline as well as with LSD. And obviously it's where the doors get their name from as well. So that was interesting. I think Matt's right. There was a lot of tracks around in the kind of late 90s where you'd have that kind of floaty ambient music, and you'd have maybe, you know, those sleep tapes or, you know, self-hypnosis tapes would be playing in the background. And it's the similar thing to that. I did try actually quickly looking up to see if I could find where the actual vocal or recording tracks had come from, because there's two tracks. There's later on, there is what I think is Huxley's wife describing his last trip. But there's the voice early on about coming out of his body and ending up in a corner of a room. I couldn't identify who that was. I don't think that's Huxley himself. It's a nice ambient track. It does have that kind of slightly late 90s feel. I agree with Matt that the piano coming in is a bit like, okay, that's fine, but maybe we could have made a bit more of that. It's not a filler track, but it's a track which exists as part of the pacing of the album, and really I think is kind of there almost to create a stage for the next track.
It does set an interesting mood, which is then changed up a gear as we get to Rama the Prophecy.
No, we don't.
No, we don't.
Oh, no, we don't.
No, I think we get to They Are So Easily Distracted.
Sorry, They Are So Easily Distracted. Keep that in. Which is not quite the same level of mood trip, is it? But it is Hawkwind drum and bass.
Yeah, in a way, this kind of pivot into jazz, which, you know, at this point, as Hawkwind have been doing weird, trippy stuff and neoclassical stuff, why not? Why not? They've certainly got the drummer for it. Lovely crashing ride cymbals and little taps and twists around the kit, which just, again, punctuate the whole thing. Yeah, like you said, the bass mixing on this is really good. Deep, sine wave style, almost double bass style, which makes the whole thing very boomy, which, again, it gives you that ballast, which allows the top end to noodle about a lot more. Again, it captures the entire sonic spectrum, which I think is really nice. Compared to the first track, I would have rather that they picked a few synths and stuck with them rather than swap synths out, because they're much more animated, they're much more melodic in this way, and it's the melody which is adding complexity this time. So adding too many synths actually makes it feel a bit busy, but that's only like in one block, and then they finally kind of sort out the ones that they're going to use, and then they go with it, and I like that a lot more. Because it's an instrumental jazz piece, it's really hard to describe, you know, so it's hard to react to, apart from I think it's fun. I think it's detailed. Again, it's animated. I was surprised to hear it, but I enjoy it. The main thing that I take away from it, though, is the ending is a bit of a puzzle for me, because just before it ends, it almost feels like we dissolve into some kind of dark early Opeth vibes again with this minor key sounding guitar. And then suddenly this vocal leaps in to steal the scene with this, they are so easily distracted by...
Heart's Desire, is it?
Heart's Desire, that's it, yeah. And I just don't feel like it's needed, because I feel like the difference between a instrumental track and a track with vocals is pretty big. Even if it's just a sample like we got with the Aldous Huxley, you use a different part of your brain to listen and imagine and process. And if there are lyrics, you want to understand them and get the story, and there's a rhythm to it, where I feel like with instrumentals, that part of your brain can wander off in a different way. And then that means that you experience tracks in a different way. And then you can listen to things like the timbre and the vibe and the flow and syncopation and all these kind of things. So to have suddenly a vocal come in at the very end, it engages that part of your brain, but for 30 seconds and goes. I find that slightly strange choice. I don't feel that line is helping, and I feel like I kind of then lose some of the appreciation of the instrumental because suddenly a vocal's come in, and a vocal is always the thing in a song which you're going to latch onto. You just do when you listen, right? Whether you want to or not. So yeah, I feel like it jumps in and re-energizes my brain and then stops. So yeah, I feel like it's like splicing 20 seconds of Rammstein into your sleep tape. There's no, it feels like it feels like a very strange thing to just put in at the end. But, you know, on the positive side, though, I do like the track. I think it's very well accomplished. Again, Hawkwind taking a swing at jazz, I think is good. I think the people they've got are good at it. I don't think they're doing much to say, oh, that's Hawkwind doing jazz. It just feels like Hawkwind doing jazz. Do you know what I mean? There's not a spin. It's just them doing jazz well. And it's just that bit at the end which kind of bugs me. But yeah, I think it's a good piece, those last 30 seconds notwithstanding.
It's interesting, Joe. This one, in some of the reviews, the jazz element of it is referenced by quite a lot of them. And it's interesting to get to this track and realize that this is the track that those headlines are referring to.
Mm-hmm. I think this is a great track. Quite surprising when it comes in from Aldous Huxley, because it's straight in with the drums. It is kind of drum and bass, but the thing it actually reminded me of more is people like Ronnie Size Represent, and Red Snapper. If you remember Red Snapper, they were the bands around that time who were trying to cross over jazz with live. So it was drum and bass, but it was all played live. And that's exactly the kind of feel to this. And I think, again, that was kind of late 90s.
Yeah, London Electricity as well with that kind of stuff, which then kind of gave birth to the whole liquid drum and bass stuff.
Yeah, it isn't just that. There is some jazz in there. I think I remember Dave saying in an interview a few years ago that he was quite a big fan of a Swedish band called EST. And some of this sounds quite a bit like them. That's kind of fast jazz, very rhythmic, but then the piano coming in as well. So that was a possible influence as to why he's gone in that direction. But I've got down in my notes that this is the point at which the It's Not Hawkwind crew will start to feel particularly excised, because it isn't Hawkwind, but it is Hawkwind because it's Hawkwind playing it. And they've had a bloody good crack at it as well. This is a good sounding track in anybody's books. And actually halfway through, it kind of then eases back from the jazz and the drum and bass sound into more of a kind of lush space rock sound. And if you want an obscure reference, it really reminded me of a German band, Eloy, who I was a very big fan of. And they were kind of like a Pink Floyd tribute act to a certain extent, but they also had this kind of slightly lush, jazzy, proggy thing going on. And it really reminds me of that. A lot of really good guitar on this as well. And it's difficult to know whether this is Dave or Magnus playing it, but I think it probably is Dave. And his guitar playing, he's a lot more confident with it these days. You know, his tone is really nice on this. I mean, it is almost a Gilmour-esque vibe on this. So, yeah, I think this is great. Richard Chadwick's finally getting a chance to be really adventurous on the drums. He's really kind of showing what he can do because he's often been very poorly served by the recordings of previous Hawkwind albums.
Yeah.
And just to say, I thought the vocal at the end is great. I love it. I think it's actually a really, really nice touch at the end to pull you out of there. And it's this really nice vocal, this kind of little space chant at the end. I think it's lovely.
And that's Richard as well, right?
I don't know, but it's certainly not Brock.
It sounds like Richard to me. I could be wrong. But yeah, I love this. And I think the album as a whole is the best I've heard Richard on the drums. And I've really enjoyed the drumming because where it is very busy, it's not busy in a way that overtakes the track, but it's filling space in a really interesting way. And the interesting thing with this track is that there is that point where it segues into something a little different that isn't the really busy drum and bass, it's something slightly more solid. And every time I listen to this track, I miss the point at which that happens. I realize it has happened, basically, and I've kind of missed where it did because, again, it's a track that I find very easy to sink into and zone out to. It's quite funny. I have to deliberately make myself focus on it to pick it up because I zone out and drift away with this track, a bit like the first one. And I'm very happy with that. And I think the tracks that I really want to zone out to, I can because they're 10 minutes plus. That's kind of a beautiful thing. It's not you have some 3 minutes that you wish was 10 minutes. The 3 or 4 minute tracks or whatever feel like they should be. And the 10-minute tracks feel like they should be. And they've got room to breathe and everything. So I do love that about the album as a whole. There's an electric piano sound in this early on, which is very reminiscent of some of the early 70s fusion things. It's a noise that comes through quite a lot in Bitches Brew, the Miles Davis, and a little bit in a silent way. In a silent way, obviously completely different rhythmically from this, but has some of those sounds in it. Yeah. And I love that electric piano noise. So things were coming up on this that I wasn't expecting, but all of them were kind of making me smile. I rather like the vocals at the end because it feels like a little coda to bring it to a close. I'm happier with it doing that than just a fade or finding a way to bring it to a conclusion. I quite like the vocals signaling that we are reaching the end of the track. Yeah. So, yeah, another bit of unexpected bliss. The next one is less unexpected because now I've got the sequencing correct. We do come to Rama the Prophecy. And interesting, this one being the one that they've released for a couple of weeks or so now. This is more what I was expecting from the band. If they dropped this straight after Hawkfest, I would have gone, yeah, that sounds like what I think this lineup would do. I think it's better than the early tracks they dropped from Somnia. The early tracks from Somnia weren't as good for me as the tracks that we then experienced when the album came out. This one does a better job of making me go, I'm really looking forward to this album than the other one does. And it's one of the better rocky tracks. It's about 8.5 minutes, so it's no 3 or 4 minute job. But yeah, it's definitely better than the end for me. Very Hawkwind lyrics. Reminded me a bit of Monster Magnet, not really for the heaviness, but more of the recycled use of those old 60s psychedelic sounds. That is something that Monster Magnet do quite a lot. The synth that sounds a bit violin-y near the end reminded me a bit of Simon House, just a reference that came to mind. Did you catch any of those vibes, Joe?
Yeah, in my notes, I've got tasteful space rock, not meant as an insult. And tasteful is perhaps the wrong word, but it's a proper head nodder of a riff. Brock's back in decent voice again, and it really does its job nicely. There's nothing on it which sounds perfunctory. It's not like, oh, we're jamming endlessly for no reason. But at the same time, I think it probably is a couple of minutes, maybe too long. But again, Dave's stretching out on the guitar, or somebody's stretching out on the guitar, and it sounds good. They're very confident at just kind of dropping into the guitar part and running with it. And it works nicely. And I think that's particularly the case on this track. My only other thought about it was that I wondered if the title, for some reason, had something to do with Rendezvous with Rama, the Arthur C. Clarke novel. primarily because I've recently read it, and so it's in my head. But I think it actually is to do with Rama, as in one of the Hindu deities, because there's a lyric about him being the seventh son or coming the seventh time. And apparently he is indeed the seventh incarnation of Vishnu. So there you go. Dave's obviously been reading up on his Hindu mythology. Nice track. Liked it.
Well, that knocks my Banana Rama theory completely out of the park, unfortunately. I've spent the last 3 or so weeks, probably longer actually, listening to Hawkwind absolutely nail things like Sword of the East. And listening to something like that and then listening to something like this feels quite flat. The difference between these instrumental bass tracks and these more rocky tracks, they feel like they were recorded in entirely different places. And I still feel, again, this all feels kind of close and a bit compressed. I found it very hard to identify the lyrics. The singing is in the same range as everything else. And again, I feel like the drums are bleeding into the guitars, which are bleeding into the vocals, which I find just, again, feels less spacious and engaging. And, you know, first time I heard Sword of the East, it grabbed me by the throat and said, you're going to listen to this for the whole damn time. And I'm like, yes, I am. And it just feels powerful. And I'm not saying they have to do that all the time, but just when I've got something that they've done like that in my head, comparing it to this, it just feels a little bit muted. Not to say that there isn't some nice things in it, like the little like synthy trills and the arrangement is quite nice. I'm with Joe. I think 4 minutes would have been fine for this. The singing sounds a little flat when they're hitting the chorus. I feel like it's obviously hitting a note they want to hit because they hit it a lot, but it just sounds a little flat to me. And I feel like the whole thing, unfortunately, just lacks bite to me and doesn't have much to enliven itself in the same way that I feel that they've done. And I'm not going to say it's not Hawkwind, but it's not the Hawkwind I've been listening to.
Do you think that's a production problem, though, Matt? I mean, the fact that it's harder maybe with the setup that Dave has to kind of really capture a good kind of rock sound, because that has been an issue, I think, on Somnia as well, where it's there, it was like, right, we're going to absolutely turn everything up to 11, certainly in the guitar department, to kind of get that crunchy sound. Whereas here, I think it works better here, actually not doing that, because I think they perhaps do realize there are certain limitations in how they're recording. And so they haven't gone for that classic stun rock guitar sound. I do wonder if it is a problem with their actual recording setup, why the rockier tracks perhaps don't cut through as much.
It may well be. I don't feel like I have the answer to that. Again, this is what happens when you do a reaction, I guess. When they did the Xenon codecs, I know it was crazy and fraught, but I also know they had a studio. In fact, they had 2 studios and an engineer, and I don't know what they're doing now. If they're, like bedrooming it right now, then it kind of sounds like they are. Maybe it's just my predisposition, my mood, whatever was going on, but I feel like I like the more spacey, floaty tracks on this. And I listen to some of these other tracks and I'm like, why is this on my lovely floaty album? Get out. Rather than see it as what it is, which is a mix of the two. When we come to do this properly in however long, I may well have changed my mind due to real repeat listening. But I guess right now I like some of the other stuff so much that I feel like some of these aren't.
They're less welcome.
Yeah, in a way, it's not convalescing in a way which I want it to. It kind of feels like I'm listening to 2 very different albums on shuffle rather than a complete journey because of that.
Right. Well, that journey continues to something which is a little bit more back to the ambience, Matt. So does USB 1 bring you back into a happier place?
Yeah, it's Hypnotic Space Grooves again, but again, slightly differently. We have a lot more skittering drums and more actual like bleepy sequencing going on, which sounds like it could be more Casio-esque or even modular or something. It's less like sort of massive style, like synthwave stuff. It's actually a lot more analog, which is nice. Again, it's bringing in a different tone. I like the almost 2001 style vocal, which leads us into it. There's something very powerful about that, which is really, really nice. I wonder why they call it USB 1, because we have USB A, B, and C, and now we have USB 1, which is like a strange name for it. It's the shortest one that they've done in terms of this. The end was 4:10. This is 4, pretty much on the nose. So we've had the rocky, the end. And so now we have the more slightly analogy, skittery, a bit more animated one. It's a solid 4 minutes. I add it to my collection of cool sounding, spacey, bleepy Hawkwind tracks that we've got on this album. I don't have many more notes because, again, it's a nice instrumental. We're about, like halfway through? Maybe just over.
About that.
Yeah, the kind of 2001 vocals, whenever I listened to this 3 or 4 times, and whenever that came through, it felt good. It's a nice thing to hear halfway through the album. There's kind of a nice push there, and keeps the energy, because I guess, if you have a whole album full of like spacey stuff, it can make an hour feel very long. And actually, this album doesn't feel like an hour. Or maybe it just feels like an hour. It doesn't feel longer. It doesn't feel like my time is being wasted. That's not the right word, but it feels as long as it is. It doesn't feel longer, because sometimes I've listened to ambient tracks. I've got plenty on record, and sometimes even then where I'm like, this, start looking at your watch halfway through. You never get that with any of these. I feel like they come in, they do their thing, and they go. And I think the fact that this one is 4 minutes just means it's nice and tight and not short.
Fair. This is another one that starts sounding quite ominous and then isn't, which does happen a few times. This is another one. I've got to say, Joe, this one, I don't dislike it. That doesn't particularly move me in any particular way. I'm quite happy with it being on for its 4 minutes, but it's not one of the more memorable ones on the album for me. How about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think actually the album is nearly 70 minutes, actually. And certainly if you were looking to cut it down, this could be one that could be easily taken out. But on saying that, it's still a perfectly nice track. I mean, really, the only notes I've got here is that even on a relatively short ambient track like that, it doesn't actually just feel like filler. All of these tracks feel like they have some purpose. They've actually been created and they have had some care and attention paid to them. Whereas other times, you'll hear similar tracks like this, a Hawkwind album, it's like, it's a jam we knocked out in 5 minutes. That'll do, frankly. And actually, everything on this album feels like there's been some care and attention and some overview. Like somebody has said, right, okay, now at this point, we're going to do this, or maybe we should produce it in this way or mix it in this way. And that's what really came through on this track is that even though it's short, it has purpose.
I just wanted to mention just quickly that despite us calling USB 1 an ambient track, it is actually one long build. It starts quite ambiently, but they are adding things to it. So actually, when it does finish, you feel like it has arrived somewhere. Where you feel like some of the others are like, the first track is quite wayward, and then the Huxley one is more self-effacing and it's dealing with its own inspiration with its own vocals and stuff. This one actually feels more like a track, if you see what I mean. It feels arranged, like we're adding the drums, we're adding the guitar, we're adding keys, and eventually when it finishes, you do feel like it's kind of grown. And eventually when it finishes, it has this lovely like wash, which is really nice. And again, I feel like this is more how I kind of wanted. I know we have our different opinions on it, but I feel like that's probably how I wanted They're So Easily Distracted to end, without the need for the vocal. I feel like they've proven that they can do it without, so maybe that's why they added it to add variety. But I do like the fact that it's just a very nicely arranged piece, as Joe was saying, that some care and detail has been done. It's not just another one, it's looking at it in a different way.
And it sounds like even these shorter tracks have been done with care. They've been constructed rather than just kind of knocked out. Yeah, absolutely. And it leads us to another one, which feels like it's in that kind of jazzier vein, which is Outside of Time. And this one sounded to me like it could have been on the Somnia album, with Dave doing that spoken part. It's got those Pink Floyd-y oohs going on in the background.
Yeah, it's got the female vocals,
Yeah, and that sound designy morphing into that sung part with Magnus. It's interesting. I could imagine this being on Somnia, but it's totally not out of place here either.
No, exactly. I think that overall, as Matt says, I think quite rightly, is that over the course of this album, if you view it as a whole, the more rocking tracks actually could easily be extracted, and you could actually just have an album which is operating at a much more mellow but still interesting vibe. I do keep going back to this, but it is so easy. I mean, there are literally thousands and thousands of ambient space rock albums out there, which are fine. You can stick on and, 40 minutes later, you've forgotten about them, but it wasn't awful. And actually, this album isn't in that category because of the care and attention that's clearly being paid to all of these tracks. Even the kind of more mellow, spacey ones, they all feel like they're going somewhere. And Outside of Time, I think it starts like that. because you've got the spoken stuff at the start. Then I think there's a lyric I've picked out here where Dave goes, "Will it be me or you?" It starts to get a little bit more sinister. The drums kind of arrive. There's a really nice bit on a shaker as well. There's lots of bits that you kind of pick out on these tracks. So you suddenly go, "Oh, that's a really nice bit there. That's really clever what they've done there." And it keeps developing. At one point, it gets to, I've written down that it has turned into yacht rock. But again, in a good way. It's pretty good. It's got that really nice mellow cosmic rock sound going on. I like the vocals. I've got another couple of appalling words here. One of them is accomplished and the other one is adult, which sound like terrible insults. But honestly, I'm listening to this and you might think, oh, it's not Born to Go or it's not Magnu. But actually, for what it is, it's actually very, very good indeed and very well done. Some great guitar in here again. I don't think it's one of the strongest tracks on the album, but it's nicely done.
Matt, accomplished yacht rock in a good way. Agreed?
Yeah, I was going to also add, this one feels a bit more dubby than we've had before. The bass line has that dub twang with it, and we have this much more solid drum loop about a third of the way through. I feel like we hit a kind of dub vibe, which again we haven't had before, but we had a bit Insomnia. So it was interesting to see this come back. I say solid drum loop. It's still kind of soft to fit the piece, but it's a lot more like it's a regular lock that again adds a groove to the piece, which otherwise again it might have kind of floated away from itself. But I think Hawkwind are very good at pulling that back. They've done that in lots of ways. The Forge of Vulcan or whatever it's called, with that clang clang kind of sounds, and some of the other tracks where you have this thing which always pulls back them to this central point. And I think Hawkwind are very good at pushing and pulling away from that. And so whenever they establish that, I always feel like they be able to color outside the lines after they've drawn where the lines are. And as a listener, I always enjoy that because you have something solid to lock onto, but you can go with them on it without feeling like you're going to get swept away. I can feel some of the Hawkwind in this more than some of the other pieces. Like the first track, if you told me it was Hawkwind, I would be surprised. This, if you said it, I'd be like, oh, maybe not immediately I'd have guessed it, but I can see why. It feels like it's got some of their classic building blocks in it. We've got some nice dreamy vocals in it, which adds to the spacey vibes in a slightly different way. Even the title feels a little bit more familiar, outside of time. We're talking about the future never waits. It feels like we're playing with a bit of a theme, even though that doesn't really come to any particular fruition. Even that around the track just helps to make it feel a little bit more familiar. And given the fact that, again, this is another long one, right? This is 7.5 minutes. And, the next two tracks are 8 minutes and change. And we've had two 10-minute tracks. This is a very chewy album, but it's still animated and detailed enough that you don't feel like it's dragging.
Cool. Well said. The next one, I need to open this up to the floor. Does anyone else get Whole Lot of Love vibes out of this?
It's quite bluesy, certainly at the start. Brock's vocal is actually really interesting here. Haven't you really heard him do a vocal like this much before? And it is that kind of bluesy vocal. And, and it fades up on that nice chunky riff. I think of the rocking tracks, this is definitely the best.
Yeah, agree.
100%. And the oohs are back. The bass is really strong. And that vocal is strong. And he's hitting some high notes and he sounds really good. And so, that early bit, I just keep getting off of the bass riff, the Whole Lot of Love riff. It's not identical, but it has that same feel to me. And I think of it every time that it comes on. And then obviously halfway through, we get that morphs back into a trademark Hawkwind spacey jam with some good swishy noises that always brings you back to a Hawkwind core. And then it does sound to me, and Matt just mentioned dub, it sounds like it's about to go into a dub bit, but then it doesn't quite decide to do that. And then it plays out in a way that I would say is kind of almost ambiguous, like they weren't quite sure how to bring it to a conclusion. But then they work out how to bring it to a conclusion, and they do. So it's kind of interesting. It feels like they're almost working this out as they go along, Matt.
Yeah, building the plane as they fly it. I'd have to listen to it again to know if it's a whole lot of love, but I do think from a riff point of view, it's probably the best constructed one in this. And I don't have the same complaints in my notes about the quality of this one, so I don't know whether or not I got used to it at this point or if it's different. But yeah, I think of all the tracks going from one side of ambient to the other side of rock, I think this one is the one which I like the most. I'm Learning to Live Today is an interesting idea. Again, I haven't really had a lot of luck nailing down lyrics in this at all, but I did feel like there was a feeling of positivity or reconciliation or something in it. That idea of having that kind of phoenix from the ashes kind of thing, or that feeling of putting something away or getting over something, but that kind of putting that positive energy out there that you're learning to live again and today's going to be the day sounded good to me. So I think there's some positivity to it, which is nice, which I guess probably things like The End and Rama don't have. But yeah, I think the Learning to Live Today, me and it can make peace that they can still do rocky things, even if I'm not quite so right now reacting positively to them. This one is a nice one. I'm glad that there is one that I like.
Doug's really powerful on this, isn't he, Joe?
Yeah, I've got it down here that around the 3-minute mark, there's a breakdown, and you have this really great rolling bass bit, which they just build around. And that's really nice because they do that really well. It builds tension within the track. And so you're right, he's very notable, the contribution he makes at that point. I think they do actually hit a bit of a space reggae groove at the end. I mean, I think Hawkwind are long past this, but there's like that time when you're listening to your favorite band and then suddenly they decide, I think this happened with Rush, for instance. Like Rush suddenly went for a big reggae phase and everybody went, oh my God, what are you doing? But again, here, Hawkwind just kind of flip into it. It's just something we're doing for this track. No need to get excited. We're just trying it out. And they do a nice job of it. And it kind of exits on this wonderful kind of lush swirl of keys at the end. It's a nice track. It is a rocker, but it progresses. It doesn't just kind of rely on that riff all the way through. And I think that works really well.
They don't feel like they're trying to do something that they're not comfortable with, do they? They feel like they're at home doing whatever it is they're doing. It doesn't feel like they're trying hard to do something outside of their comfort zone. It just feels like they're being them, whatever it is they try and do, which is, I guess, something of a unique Hawkwindy thing. We go on to the beginning, which I'd like to start off this one, because I've got to say, I love this track so much. I grin from ear to ear while this is on. It's my favourite new Hawkwind song for a long time, for a few reasons, actually. I love the samples, particularly the one that off-air Matt suggested had more than a hint of Douglas Adams in it, which is the guy who says, look at the form where you ticked the box marked, yes, I suppose that would be best for everyone. All that kind of thing is amazing. And it's interesting, I'm guessing this was written towards the back end of last year, because I was at Hawkfest when the new album was announced. And since then, obviously, the whole world of generative AI has absolutely exploded. And that's basically my life at the moment. Doing projects, doing talks, writing stuff. So today I have been working on generative AI stuff with this playing. It's felt really appropriate and has made me smile while I've been doing it. And then, of course, from a musical point of view, the drums come in and they come in John Bonham-esque, really solid. And again, it's brilliant. It's Richard. Those keyboard sounds are so satisfying. You almost want the sounds to appear, and then they do. And everything just feels like you want it to feel. The funny thing with this being 8.5 minutes was, I was thinking, usually long Hawkwind tracks morph somewhere. Is it going to stay this good throughout? Or is it going to go somewhere different? And first listen, I was slightly nervous. And then, of course, the acoustic guitars came in. And my first thought was, oh no, you're going to ruin it for me. But they rescue it. It goes into this Beatles kind of sound, which is obviously a Magnus piece. I don't know whether the whole thing is a Magnus piece, but that bit certainly is. And they've bring back the computers have become alive thing, which they teased with in the end. And there's some lovely lyrics in there, such as free yourself from this human sack and things like this, which again are just really nice. I like a lot of Magnus's lyrics, but not all of them by any means. But I like his lyrics here. And I quite like Richard's Davros voice that kind of comes in to double track the vocals near the end. And Dave's ending, to me, is beautiful. The end of this track is beautiful. So yeah, this is one of my favorite tracks anywhere right now. So hopefully you're not both about to completely shoot it down.
Yeah, this might be another China Blues situation, Andy. Watch out.
Exactly.
I would absolutely agree. I would defy any Hawkwind fan not to feel that this track, one way or another, is pretty cool. It's very, very, very funny. The first time I heard the thing about the questionnaire and referring to it, that made me laugh out loud. And again, I've tried to track down where these have come from, and I can't find them. Could an AI have actually spoken them?
100%, yeah.
So that's, I think, what's happened.
Yeah, that tick your box thing, that is a voice that you can just get Apple to read your messages in. So I think a lot of it is synthesized. I believe that they're not samples. I believe that all of that is original from them.
In which case, those lines are brilliantly written. Very, very funny. It sounds like, something from like some kind of bleak Black Mirror-esque comedy, because it starts with upload your consciousness here and leave your body at the door marked incinerator. It's just, this is Calvert-esque levels of comic invention, sci-fi satire. This is what happens when the AI has taken over and has said, carbon-based life forms, it'd probably be best if you just uploaded yourself now. I'll get rid of your bodies. But then there's that brilliant one where it says the phasing out of carbon-based life forms is now unavoidable. But rest assured of fewer being kept in captivity and will be released back into the wild when it is deemed safe to do so. That's brilliant. I mean, that is so funny. It's really inventive. And as you say, and the drums behind it is great. It's really super. And then it goes into this lovely kind of acoustic bit. I've got kind of Magnus here as a folk singer propagandist for the AI overlords who, it's a bit like in Children of Men when there's all of these government propaganda adverts for the end of life drugs. It's a similar kind of nice folky ditty, telling everybody it really would be best if you left your bodies behind and turned yourself into data. But then there's this superbly poetic line right at the end of Magnus's bit where he says, you'll go by file transfer to the stars, which suddenly made me think that's actually quite profound. Because on one level, it's quite funny, but on another level, it's like, okay, well, maybe actually that is it. That's how we'll go to the stars. When the robots have established something on the planet 10 light years away and they set up the receiving station, and then we'll be transmitted directly to the receiving station. And I agree. I think the bit with Dave at the end is really quite touching. It's a brilliant track. It's absolutely brilliant. I defy anybody not to like this track. Matt.
Well, Joe, I would just like to say that I was waiting for a track like this, the whole album, which I could say, oh, that's the Hawkwind that I know. And this is it for me. Without wanting to repeat too much of what you guys have said, there are some really good opening lines of sci-fi books. For example, the sky was the color of television tuned to a blank channel is an amazingly evocative line. And that's the first line of Neuromancer, right? So this, please proceed to the upload center and leave your body at the incineration door, is the kind of one line where you're just like, okay. The first time you hear it, it's just Spirit of the Age-esque in terms of, okay, we're here, we're somewhere, this feels real. It feels like the kind of thing you could hear. And when I heard it, I had an almost like visceral reaction to that idea. Even if I had uploaded myself and I thought that was a good idea, the idea of never being able to return to your body and having it completely obliterated by fire is such a strange concept still. I had a very profound reaction to it. And Hawkwind are one of those bands which, when they nail that, they can mess with you in that kind of way, because the way they've said it sounds so matter of fact, a bit like the forms to freeze you line. It's the way that they word it sometimes, it's just enough to make you feel like it's believable. The fact that they say it several times, for me, slightly lessens the joke. I would love it two of them have just said it just once and then just let people go, wait, what? And then just proceed. Or that actually what I was thinking was, wouldn't it have been great if they'd actually said it, but in different languages? Because for me, that would have just got that idea of like, you're in a huge processing place. How like in the airport, they'll be like, please go to gate 1, but then they'll say it in French and Spanish and stuff. I'd have loved that if they'd have just said that same thing, because you'd have figured it out. They're like, oh yeah, they're saying incineration room in Swahili or something. But it would have been great, because for me, that would have made it feel like it's all people in an interesting way. So like if I was to remix this track ever, I would totally have just done that. I feel like that would have conveyed the epicness in another way. We just had weird things like Mutation Zone and Heads from Xenon Codex. So to have something like this is really nice to have in what is otherwise a nice instrumental album, but might have been lacking some of that, Hawkwind imagination, as you said, kind of playfulness. There's some kind of silliness in here, the way they word the, yeah, you ticked the, yeah, all right then form. Like you said, they build on it. They don't tell you a full story. You hear it in almost like snatches of news readings. Like you said about for the good of the world, carbon-based humans have to be removed. Which is funny because I know that we are carbon-based, but I was thinking about, one of the reasons that we may need to go is because we pollute a lot. And so incinerating us seems like a bad idea. Just like, I feel like that's going to be a lot more carbon in the atmosphere. But also, that idea of a few have been kept in captivity. The word captivity was strange because you immediately think of like a zoo, and therefore who's the zookeeper? It's not humans, because otherwise they'd have said some of us. It sounds like, maybe robotic overlords are looking after us and they're like, hey guys, just upload yourself, it's fine, and we'll just get rid of your meat sack and you can go to the stars. So there is that weird feeling, isn't it? That kind of, to get something like to go to the stars, would you give up your corporeal access to then where you'd go? And
I would.
Yeah, fair enough.
But there is a lot of philosophy in this song. I mean, there's lots to think about, because it's obviously playing on being kind of a good carbon neutral citizen, and the best thing you could then do is to actually get rid of this terrible polluting body. But it's interesting because at first you think this is a black satire and they're thinking, oh, how terrible. But I don't know, actually. By the end, I'm kind of wondering whether maybe Brock, who is a very strong eco warrior kind of guy, maybe, he's got to that age now and he's concluded, we are the problem. Maybe this isn't such a bad thing. So maybe actually this isn't that satirical.
Perhaps it's time we left this world today then. It does hark back to all the way back.
Exactly, yeah. It's exactly that. The file transfer to the stars thing is just genius line. It's brilliant. It is updating that concept totally for the modern age.
I wrote conversational Dave at the end of this, which is nice because it starts off almost a bit like theatrical somehow. Like I feel like if this was like a musical number, sometimes they bring it down and people speak rather than sing, and it changes the vibe. And then he kind of goes into a bit of song, but just that little bit kind of feels like you're being talked down. It's almost like the voice you'd need to hear if you were wavering about incinerating yourself.
Uncle Dave says it's not going to be so bad. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, so Dave coming down as well. Like, it's all right, everybody. Don't worry. Very soon you'll be at peace and file transferring yourself to the stars. They're like, all right, Dave, strike a match. Let's go.
Let's do this.
So yeah, I think in conclusion, this is a definite highlight. For me, it makes it a Hawkwind album. I'm glad it exists because we didn't get this in Somnia in the same way, but Somnia, I do feel, was one thought explored over a lot of tracks. This album is music. I don't think it is a thought exploration in the same way. So to have one of these in here is the other way that they do that, in the same way that Xenon, I feel like, is more music, but they have some of these little thought experiments and a bit more experimental stuff. So yeah, to have this in here still makes me feel like at the core, there is this imagination and this sense of humor and this way of talking about science fiction in a way which feels palpable, in a way which other bands don't do. And, and this thought has survived Calvert. It's survived Neville Neil. It's survived everyone. It's still there. And everyone who's in the band is somehow possessed with it eventually to create things like this. And that's fantastic.
That's very, very well put. It is indeed the most Hawkwindy Hawkwind, while still being very, very new at the same time. Yeah, I kind of get chills even talking about this track. I love it. That's the first thing I'll do when we finish recording, is put it back on. But we must round out the album because there's a little bit of a coda. It's only 3 minutes long at the end, which kind of leads directly in after the beginning, which is trapped in this modern age, which again has kind of an ominous feel at the beginning, but doesn't progress that way. I felt that this was quite a nice coda to the album. What did you think, Matt?
I thought it was okay. It's funny that the track called A Beginning, which feels like it's trying to put that positive spin on what's going on. You're not dying and being set on fire. It's a new beginning for you as you're uploaded and going to do stuff. I think that adds to either the positivity or the propaganda, depending on your opinion. So then to flip that on its head and talk about this modern age and being trapped in it, because it's a coda, is it attached? Is it just following on? I haven't really resolved that yet. I feel like this modern age is kind of a cantankerous, get off my lawn kind of thing to say. In the same way that, because Hawkwind have always been so futuristic in their look. Modern age sounds a bit kids these days somehow. It's only modern because it's now. It's fine. I think the vocal feels, again, a little bit return to that sort of flattishness. It's certainly not my favourite way that Hawkwind have ever ended an album. By this point, I think we've hit the high point. and then we're kind of going out, but it doesn't really outstay its welcome. It's fine. I've never felt Hawkwind have felt old, even though I know that Dave Brock just turned 80, and I know they've been going for such a long time. This is possibly the first time they felt a little malcontent. Not poetically and not spiritually or beliefy. It just feels a little bit like, ugh, this modern age, which is, just feels a bit beneath them somehow. But it's fine. It's just not quite the iron dream, to finish us out after this bit of inspiration they've just had.
Yeah, I mean, I think musically it's a relatively upbeat coda, follows on from the beginning, has the same lyrics at the start. I know what Matt says about this modern age. It's either that or it's like, like the Jam. It's the modern world. It's got whenever anybody uses that word. But Dave I think he's 81 now, isn't he?
Thought he was 82.
No, I think he's 81. But to be honest, at the age of 81, I should imagine I'll be talking about being trapped in the modern age from dawn until dusk, or until I'm wheeled away into my secure padded cell in the retirement home. I did wonder whether the trapped in the modern age was actually, him saying we're trapped in this kind of particular, because the modern age, such as it is kind of completely screwed up and messed up. And it feels like we haven't got that much further forward from when they were beginning in the 1970s. In some ways, we've gone backwards. And, I'm wondering whether it is just more kind of evidence that actually Dave thoroughly approves of us destroying our carbon-based bodies and truly kind of entering the digital realm.
It's interesting Matt said that this is an album of music that doesn't carry a concept all the way through. And I would agree with that. But there is a concept, I think, that crops up repeatedly in different songs. And like the end, the beginning, obviously, learning to live today, trapped this modern age, there is a thing, I think, about technology in particular and the state of the world from that point of view, and either an acceptance or a rejection of it, but different kind of ways to approach it, I think seem to come up for me thematically at different points in the album. So it's not like a concept, it's not Dark Side of the Moon, but it's songs with certain lyrics, and I would pick up and go, okay, they're fixed on this. The beginning is the magnum opus of that exploration, but it crops up in different ones, and I think it's in this as well. There's an element of acceptance to it, I think.
Yeah, I think also actually, just in they are so easily distracted. Obviously, it completely makes me think of the hyper acceleration that we have, online and the social media. That's the first thing that sprang to my mind.
Same.
And that obviously is a very big issue. It stops us from concentrating often what matters. So I would agree. It's not a concept album, but there definitely seems to be that theme kind of running through it. And as you say, it's kind of made just before. AI, you guys are probably a bit more involved in it, but AI via things like ChatGPT has really become suddenly very real in the last few months, really. People have been talking about AI for a long time, and now it's suddenly everybody, if they want to, has suddenly seen what it can do. And, we've had discussions about potentially the worrying consequences for that in all different ways. And this feels like actually here's an album which is kind of starting to put a toe in that world and saying, this is what's coming next. We need to have a reckoning with it.
Absolutely. And I think quite intelligently as well. It would be easy if you sat down and decided to write an album about, AI and all this kind of stuff. It could so easily come off as incredibly cheesy and cheap science fiction, if you like. But that's not the approach here. It is written before everything truly exploded, because that's literally been this year. And this album was I think, in the bag by then. But it fits so beautifully. There's a serendipity to its release and what is happening right now. If I do another TED Talk on AI, then the beginning will be my walk on music. I think that would make me very happy. They've tapped a certain vein, I think, going on right now. And the music really fits that. So it might be coincidence, but they've done it really well and really elegantly, I think, across the album. And that is the album. And we've had more good things to say than bad things to say, I would reckon, Joe.
I think this is probably their strongest, most consistently good album since The Machine Stops.
I was going to say exactly the same.
Yep, there's been obviously good tracks on albums since then, but in terms of a listening experience from beginning to end, as I said, it's maybe a little long. You could have lost a couple of tracks, but actually at no point, for me anyway, do I think, oh, that's awful, or I don't want to listen to that again. All of these tracks are good, and there's 2 or 3 real highlights. Obviously the beginning, I think They're So Easily Distracted is great. I think the title track is great. They're just kind of expanding what they do a little bit, and they're doing it very, very well. And I've got to come back to, we're saying at the start, it's got to be to do with the fact they're now a proper 5-piece band again. They're all playing together. Tim and Doug are both excellent musicians. They're bringing a lot on this album, but maybe not in a direction that you expected. They really have expanded their musical palette here.
Matt, what I wanted to get your take on is that recently I've read a few interesting articles from other bands who've been around for a long time. There was Daltrey from The who thought it would be pointless to record any more music. I think it was Paul Stanley of Kiss saying that they wouldn't ever record new material because nobody's interested in it. They just want to hear all the old hits. And then there was, I think, Rob Trujillo, the bass player in Metallica, who had a fantastic quote, which was that the Metallica fans are the best fans in the world, but they don't want to see us experiment. And I thought, yeah, that's an interesting definition of best fans in the world, isn't it? Keep cranking it out. Don't you dare innovate. But Hawkwind still doing genuinely new music, seemingly for the love of it, taking creative risks. And that's why they're such an interesting band for you to be diving into, right, with me on the podcast.
Yeah, I mean, this album is once again seeing them go into places which for me, they haven't gone yet. They are never derivative. Sometimes they do things which I think they nail. Sometimes they do things which I question personally as a listener. But I don't think there's anything where you feel like they're treading water. If anything, you feel like they'd rather not put something out until they've got something. And I think sometimes you get that with even things like Chronicle of the Black Sword, where, I don't know, hypothetically, they might be like, do you know what, guys, we've got no ideas. Let's just read this and do something about it. They find input. They find things to react to or play with, or they bring in other people. They're not a band which is isolationist in any way. Either sometimes people leave or get thrown out, or they find people and go, hey, do you want to join us? And it's that constant change and constant motion that does still keep them interesting. And I think, there's been lots of parity with Steven Wilson. He's remixed things and clearly has been inspired by them. And we've gone and seen Steven Wilson before, and definitely I've seen him and been disappointed that he's played for 2 hours and not played X. But that's not what he does. He puts a set together, or he's like, this is all the new stuff. And when you go and see Hawkwind, you can never be sure what they're going to play. They might throw anything in. If you are a fan, I think you have to embrace that. And it's funny that Joe said there's this isn't Hawkwind or not my Hawkwind or something. I have bits which I like about Hawkwind, and I think we just talked about the track which brought us all together, so there's clearly a through line for us in that. But there's nothing which makes me feel like Hawkwind aren't allowed. I would never dream of trying to gatekeep Hawkwind as a fan and try and corral them, because I have other bands for that. There are some bands which immediately plow their own furrow, but Hawkwind have never done that. Even with the Live Chronicles, I know that there were some derivative jokes about it being a bit like Stonehenge from Spinal Tap. Hawkwind does a semi-ambient album, might be a joke for another band, like they've lost their way, or it's like the Simpsons go Calypso. But it's actually when they do it, you're interested to see what they're going to do with it, because you feel like they are going to take it seriously. I don't think they've ever knocked anything out for the hell of it, at least in my my estimation. So the fact that this is still new and interesting is cool, and again, so different from Somnia even.
Totally. And Joe, it's great hearing them sound so strong and confident, really, on their 35th album in their 53rd year or whatever it is.
Yeah, it's incredible. And I think the point that you make is absolutely right. They absolutely don't need to do this. A long time ago, they could have stopped doing new material. But there's something certainly within Brock that just keeps him pushing forward. This interview actually hasn't come out yet, but I contributed some questions to an interview with Dave in Shindig. And I'd asked him this question before, actually, and he could have slightly brushed it aside, but somebody else asked it to him this time, and he actually addressed it. The idea that, he's obviously getting on a bit and he's not going to be around forever, although he does give a good impression of being immortal. But whether or not Hawkwind could credibly do what somebody like Gong have done and basically pass the baton and continue with a band known as Hawkwind without the main guy. And I've wondered about that and thought that's probably not going to happen. This album is the first time where I thought, maybe, if this band keeps together, I think that could be possible.
Yeah, and even if they did something and they didn't call it Hawkwind, I'd be very interested to see what happens next with this group of musicians in whatever form that is. Magnus definitely seems to have settled in a very Hawkwind capacity in terms of what he writes, what he plays, what he sings. So yeah, that'd be really, really interesting. Obviously, another part of this album, other than the music and the lyrics and the themes, is the cover. And we're not quite so blown away by the cover, are we, Matt?
We are sufficiently underwhelmed, I think. It's a puzzle, this album cover for me, because it looks like a label's Best of Hawkwind design rather than an actual album, I would say.
That's very well put.
It feels like it hasn't been put together with a huge amount of heart, which, again, you know, Hawkwind's audiovisual thing has normally meant that the covers, even if I haven't always enjoyed them, I've seen the work gone into them. We've had a lot to talk around. And this one does feel quite rudimentary. It feels like I could probably make this with my Photoshop skills. You know, it doesn't feel like a lot of time's been put into it. You know, like the bands find to just hang out and jam in the stratosphere rather than saying something specific, which again is perfectly fine. They've done it before. It's more musical. They're there playing music, but it doesn't have that feeling of like, you know, we have something to say or we built something around a theme. And I feel that idea is also further compounded by the use of the Hawkwind logo, which is the Hawkwind 50th anniversary logo, which they haven't used in an album ever. They've always had that very blocky Hawkwind font for the last several releases. It looks like, oh, it's the Future Never Waits tour. Even things like, you know, the Future Never Waits is curved, but it's not curved with the stratosphere, which again is slightly unpleasing. And the, you know, the OCD-ness for me kind of winds me up a little bit. I was also surprised that, again, for an album, the band is on the cover. I went through as many albums as I could look today, and despite them kind of being in Space Bandits in the background and they're illustrated, I don't think the band's ever been on an album cover. I think the albums have always been something else to help bring you into the idea of the album. And to see these guys as a band on Earth with a bit of space and that logo all makes me feel like it's not the same kind of experience as we've had before. It feels like it looks like a live album. It almost looks like a bootleg cover. It's a shame given some of the quality that we have on here.
Yeah, it's fun, isn't it? Because although we didn't know what the Somnia cover was, and it turned out to be this kind of strange mashup of different things, one of them was a famous painting, I remember we found out in the end. It still did look like a deeply mysterious cover that seemed in tune with the concepts on the album. And there are some strong things in this. I could imagine, you know, some kind of illustration of an incineration booth or the form that you tick that says, yes, I suppose that's best for everyone. Things like that you could have done that would have tied the cover to the record in a way that this one doesn't seem to do. And I would mind it slightly less if the band weren't in it. And strangely for me, I don't really think of the individuals particularly. It's almost like a movie poster. I think of the concepts and the theme. You know, when I see the poster for Blade Runner, I don't see Harrison Ford. I see Rick Deckard. If it was a big picture of Harrison Ford standing there, you know, with thumb up, that would take me out of Blade Runner. I'm probably not making any sense here, but there's something about the band being on the cover slightly takes me away from this concept of this Hawkwind thing. Does that make sense, Joe?
Absolutely. I mean, it's not a great cover, but I do wonder if, thinking about it now, if the reason why the band is on there is exactly the reason we've discussed, basically wanting to say, look, here we are again as a band playing together. And that's actually kind of an important point for them. What it does remind me of, thinking about it, I'm just looking at it now, is actually this would have made a perfectly nice inner gatefold a la the first album. Because, of course, the first album is exactly the same thing. It actually does have them playing there in front of the Stonehenge of amps. And this would have made actually a perfectly decent inner gatefold. But I agree that certainly some of the music and certainly the beginning does lend itself to them to, you know, actually to come out of the slight kind of sci-fi comfort zone and actually to make something a bit more abstract. harking back to something like Hawk Lords or stuff like that, something a bit different where you go, oh, is this Hawkwind? Oh, okay. Because that's to a certain extent what some people might think when they hear some of the tracks on the album. And I think that's a great idea, actually incorporating, the form or something somewhere on the album, because it's one of those things that often an album will suddenly seem like it's got much more of a theme than it actually has, depending on the actual album cover. And if you'd have included something like that, you would have straight away thought this album is about this. But as it is, it does look like it's been rather disappointingly lot together. And I agree, that is the wrong logo for this album.
It was an interesting point, though, Joe, you making about the band wanting to be seen as a band playing together. I hadn't thought of that. So I'll let that sink in over the next few days. On the whole, then, it's a pretty good return for the band. And I think we've said all we're going to say about The Future Never Waits. Joe, what's keeping you busy? Although still so many things coming out of Days of the Underground and the vault that you put together.
Exactly. I mean, I have a Twitter feed, and I'm going to change the description of it very soon to Classic Hawkwind Trivia Hub. I discover things, and often from Facebook or from other places as well. And, there's always something with Hawkwind. There's some bands who are totally knowable, like everything about them seems to be known. Hawkwind, there's constantly things, even now, cropping up. In particularly the 70s, which is my period of expertise, if you like. You think, I didn't know that, or kind of like, that's new, which is intriguing. And so obviously I've been doing that. So I am at the moment writing another book, and it's one of the worst kept secrets. I told you so about it the last time, exactly. So this is the Peter Hamill Van de Graaff Generator book, which is going to be, I think, follow probably a similar format to Days of the Underground, a very, very, very deep dive into their music and Peter Hamill's ideas and his whole persona and what he's about and his philosophy. And that's going quite well, actually. I've produced quite a few words already. It will probably be out sometime in 2025 if things go according to plan. So it's still a little in the distance. But the other thing I mentioned at the start that is Hawkwind related and hasn't been announced before, so this is a world first for you, is that I am currently just putting the finishing touches to a new updated version of not Days of the Underground, but of Sideways Through Time, which was the companion volume that came with the special edition. Andy, did you have the special edition of the book?
No, I missed out on the special edition.
So the special edition actually came with an extra book of interviews, because actually, I interviewed so many people, and at the end of the day, I actually didn't use a lot of those interviews in the book, and I thought, well, this is crazy. And so,
is this your B-sides and rarities album?
Yeah, exactly. So as a special edition, this is basically all of the interviews I did came as a separate volume, and so there was only 500 of those. And they obviously sold out very quickly. And I was umming and ahhing about doing this because obviously that's one of the things that makes the special edition special. But I've talked to quite a lot of other Hawkwind-related people and Hawkwind people since then. And it just seems crazy, not to do something with that. So there's going to be a second edition of that, and it's going to come out, should be sometime this year. As I say, I'm just putting the finishing touches to that. I counted today, it's got 34 interviews in it. So it's pretty comprehensive as an oral history of Hawkwind in the 1970s.
Oh, that's fantastic. Something else for Hawkwind fans to be excited about this year. As if there wasn't enough already. Well, you'll sell one, I'm right here. And Matt's allowed to read the 70s stuff now.
Exactly. Matt, you can read Andy's copy.
Exactly.
That's a good thing when you have two hosts. That's two sales, because we're in different countries.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
That's great.
Awesome. Well, look, Joe, this has been brilliant to have you back again. And hopefully, who knows, there might be something else we can do a reaction show on. We keep our fingers crossed. But for now, we've got something that we all pretty much like to enjoy. It's been brilliant having you back on, and look forward to chatting to you some more down the line.
Thanks very much, guys. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks, man. And thank you, Matt. The future has waited enough. We will be back with season 3 and the beginning of the 1990s very soon.
You've been listening to Hawkbinge. It was devised and presented by Andy Hood and Matt Longstaff. The soundtrack was produced by Don Music Presents. To contact the show, drop us a message on Instagram, Facebook or Twitter by searching @Hawkbinge, or send an email to podcast@hawkbinge.space. Hawkbinge is part of the Deep Dive Podcast Network. To find more great band-focused podcasts like this one, head to @DeepDivePodNet on Twitter and dive in. Thank you as always for listening. We'll see you next time.